We have three panellists, as I indicated earlier on, and the first of those is Ross Womersley from the South Australian Council of Social Service, and I'd like to invite him up to respond to Peter. You have to use them.
Thank you, John. And thank you very much, Peter. One of the things that I love about our friends in academia is when they bring to us information that confirms common sense. And because no one, in a sense, sometimes it's very hard to make these arguments about what's going on. And so it does help to have someone who can pour through these numbers and make some sense of it and then be able to regurgitate it to us in a way that we can all understand. One of the things that I was struck by this budget was that from the outset, particularly those measures that were directed at young and unemployed people, seemed to be overly harsh. But there were a range of other measures that have been referenced in part today that were equally harsh in terms of taking stuff away from people. And it did feel, despite some small kinds of allowances that were directed at taking some money from the rich temporarily, that in a sense the people who were going to wear the brunt of the problem were going to be those people who had the least capacity to do it. And so I was really worried at the outset, and I continue to be really worried about what the implications are. And I particularly continue to be worried about it because there are additional implications in our part of the world, in South Australia. And the report that John and his colleagues have released this week, I commend to all of you. But it is absolutely clear we at the moment haven't got an economy that is bursting with enthusiasm. And so it's also clear that we have parts of our community, both regional and in metropolitan Adelaide, where we have real difficulties with unemployment, massive levels, and particularly we have difficulties with young people and unemployment. And you simply can't tell me that the idea of punishing those people by insisting or removing their income support payments for sort of what could be up to 11 months in the year, not the 6 months in the year, is actually going to do anything but to drive them into disengagement, disenfranchisement, into poverty, and into circumstances where they will be left having to thieve for a life. Unless they're fortunate enough to be in a family where there are additional resources that enable those people to be looked after. And of course that's going to have profound impacts. Most of the families who are going to have the hardest time with that are the people who are in the middle of one of those bad times that we all experience. And they will actually be profoundly impacted on in this context. And I think that, again, I would just like to say thank you for sort of outlining that stuff, Peter. The other thing I thought I'd reflect on is I'm struck by the idea of entitlement. And one of the places that I saw entitlement in recent years was in the faces of a couple of people who are extraordinarily wealthy, who were standing on the back of tray tops, addressing their miners and saying, we can't pay any more tax. We shouldn't pay any more tax. Now for me, that would seem to me to be a level of entitlement. And in lots of ways, what we've seen over the last couple of years is we've lost that discussion. We actually didn't get the opportunity to ensure that people who have more do actually pay more. It's very interesting, we ran in the lead up to the last state election, SACOSS ran a pre-election campaign focused on the idea that government, no matter what colour it was going to be, wasn't actually getting the income it needed in order to be able to continue to provide the services that we all want as a community. Now, of course, this budget has brought that into even sharper focus because the federal government have sort of removed massive amounts of money that was expected in budgets into the future. But one of the things that we did in the lead up to that is we did some focus groups, and it was very interesting. I happened to sit in on a couple of the focus groups, and everybody in the focus group agreed that people should pay more tax. The thing was that it was everybody other than them. So I think that's kind of just a very brief reflection on some of the things that we've heard, and thank you again, Peter.
Thanks very much, Ross. I'd just like to invite Alice Clark to join us, and Alice is the Executive Director of Shelter SA. Thanks, Alice.
Thank you, John, and I'd like to also thank you, Peter, and commend the work of both of you. As Ross said, this is very important for sectors who can use this data for their advocacy and their policy work. So yes, again, thank you, Peter, for being an academic who does such work or just gets your PhD student to do it for you. Very well done. Look, Shelter SA is the peak body for housing in South Australia, so there'll be no surprise I'm going to talk about housing and what some of these changes might mean for people's homes in the state. And I also participated in the consultation around the report, which I was very privileged to do. So Shelter's vision is that every South Australian has a safe, secure and affordable place to live. And for people from other cultures, especially Aboriginal people, that those homes are culturally appropriate. So while so much homelessness exists in South Australia and Australia, we must also concern ourselves with homelessness because we can't ever achieve our vision while that situation exists. So I'm very pleased that of the two-pager that's on your chairs, you'll see that housing has made it into the two-pager, and I'm very pleased about that. It's a source of frustration to me that often, in the lead up to the South Australian election, for example, there was absolutely no mention of housing. And at Shelter SA, we see housing as fulfilling a basic human need, that it's a basic human right. And it is the basis upon which education, employment, good health, and fulfilling your potential can be reached. So there are particular challenges around housing in terms of what the Commonwealth's doing at the moment. We know there's going to be a federalism review that's due to be completed at the end of next year. And part of that review will involve the federal government thinking about whether or not they have a role in housing and homelessness policy and funding into the future. There's a lot of uncertainty as well around what our state government is going to do around housing and homelessness policy and funding. So it would be very nice that while we're waiting for the Commonwealth to make up their minds, that our state government let us into some of their plans for the future. So in terms of people up to the age of 30 having no income for 6 or to 11 months, as Ross said, of course there's a significant impact on their ability to pay for their housing, no matter where they live. So in public housing, or Housing SA, or Housing Trust as some people still call it, anecdotally we're told that those renters will not be evicted from their homes. But I can't speak for Housing SA, I can't confirm that. And being a public housing provider, that would be very desirable, but I don't know what these people are going to live on while they remain in their homes, or how they'll pay their electricity bills, or buy food, in fact. It's also very hard for Shelter SA to obtain data from Housing SA to tell us how many households that will affect. We have made a request, so certainly keep in touch with Shelter SA if you would like to know more about that. it will impact also in the two-pager that you've received on your chairs. It will impact to the tune of about $130 million over the next 10 years on the public housing system. So there's also community housing in South Australia, and their tenants will be in the same situation. If they're not receiving any income, they won't be able to pay their rent. And again, I don't have sector data, but it will definitely impact on those people, and there will be evictions as a result. The private renters are probably one of the groups I'm concerned about the most, because the way our private rental system's set up, it will just not respond to people who can't pay their rent for a week or two. When we talk to people at Shelter SA about what might happen to them if they were to lose their job, how long could you survive and pay your rent or your mortgage? And for most people, it's no longer than 4 weeks. So I don't see how really a week for people on very low incomes or 6 months is going to be sustainable for those private renters. We are bound to see a rise in homelessness. I have no doubt that if these changes proceed, that is what will occur. And Simon may talk about increases that we're already seeing in child neglect, in family conflict, and in domestic violence, which are all things that can lead to homelessness. We know that our child protection system is pretty much in shreds. I have thoughts on that, but I'll leave that to the child protection experts. And also, as Ross said, we're going to see families relying on families for accommodation and for support, to have somewhere to stay and something to eat. And for people living on low incomes, that sort of financial pressure and social pressure is going to be unsustainable. There are the mortgagees, people who are buying their homes. If you're on a very low income, you probably wouldn't be eligible for a home loan product anyway, or even aspire to be in the home ownership market. And they may be able to negotiate with their banks. I'm not so clear on what the picture looks like for those people. There are two final groups of people who are very vulnerable in our society, and they are people who live in supported residential facilities, or we used to call them boarding houses. And the majority of those people are receiving disability support pensions, but there will be increasingly more of them who are on New Start, and they are, I would argue, our state's most vulnerable adults. And then there's people living in boarding houses. So there are more and more people resorting to living in boarding houses, which I couldn't imagine would be a very desirable place to live without any security of tenure. And there is no doubt that you would be thrown out the day you were told you couldn't pay your rent. So if the age of entitlement is over, it seems that the entitlement to a basic human right of shelter is also over, and that will definitely be to the detriment of our society.
Thank you very much, Alice. Our final panellist is Simon Schrapel, Chief Executive Director of Uniting Communities. If you could welcome Simon.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Peter. There is something very powerful about evidence, isn't there, if people are prepared to actually take note of it. And I think it should always outweigh rhetoric. And I think Peter's presentation, highlighted, the stark gap really between really strong evidence in terms of what the impacts are and what the information is that sits behind that, as opposed to somebody's views about how we should actually be treating people in society. But given Peter did give us so much evidence, I'm actually going to stick with rhetoric for my little spiel. I didn't come along with lots of slides, and I think there was probably about 20 of them we didn't get to see, which was a great pity, but it was a really rich presentation indeed. I wanted to pick up on one of the points in one of the slides that Peter showed us, which pointed to how well targeted our payment systems are compared to other countries. And it sort of belies this sort of discussion and sort of mythology that we have about middle class welfare to some extent in Australia, because there's been a fair bit of debate about that. What we really need is a tighter targeting of our welfare to make sure that those who most warrant it and most deserve it actually get it. And we've seen some of those changes, particularly with family tax benefits, that have tried to actually rein them in on the basis of tighter income testing. But I think one of the problems is that we've probably got to look at this system of payments much more broadly, and Peter did touch on this. And we often talk about a tax and transfer system. A couple of years ago, I had it was probably not the pleasure, but I actually spent 2 days of my life at Wayne Swan's tax forum in Canberra. It's 2 days I'll never get back, but it was probably some things I learnt from it. And that was on the back of, as many of you would know, the Henry tax review that was undertaken, which was a pretty powerful document. And I have to say that there'd be many, probably in this room, and certainly many advocates, social justice advocates, that wouldn't have been pleased with all of the Henry tax review and some of the recommendations in it. But it was a pretty reasonable effort of trying to recalibrate the system. And when we look at where the benefits go, I think there were 3 things that certainly were mentioned over those 2 days, but the government at the time didn't have the courage to address them, and this government certainly doesn't seem to have the courage to address them. And it's a different form of welfare, and it's because we often sort of focus on the issue of our tax system in terms of what that means for individuals. But it's the 3 things that that I certainly picked up out of that tax forum that probably need further focusing on, and certainly advocates like SACOSS and ACOSS and Welfare Rights and others and Uniting Communities have been trying to get some attention on are what's happening in our superannuation system, which significantly benefits the wealthy, who can actually put away quite large slabs of money into their super funds and get the tax benefits at the same time, and avoid paying their fair share of tax and do the sort of level of lifting they should be doing. The second one, and at the same time it's interesting that we've got a government that's cut back the very meagre benefits for low-income people by having co-contributions into their superannuation payments. So what we'll see is a bigger gulf between the wealthy and the poor in terms of their retirement savings. The second area is negative gearing, and that's got a bit of a debate recently too in the community, where those housing advocates have come out, or the housing industry advocates have come out in defence of negative gearing. It doesn't stimulate growth in the economy, it actually just enables those people with wealth to actually speculate, and it drives up house prices, which means access to the housing system gets tougher and tougher for a lot of low-income people. And it puts wealth back into the pockets of those that have got money to invest, because once again they get very generous tax benefits out of that arrangement. And the third was something that the Howard government put in place a number of years ago, which was the capital gains rebate, the 50% capital gains rebate. So 3 really big ticket items that cost the government billions of dollars, which that could have actually tackled if it really felt that it had a budget crisis it had to deal with this time round, by actually pulling some of the levers in those 3 areas. Alas, it didn't. The second point I want to make is what I fear is really a very unhealthy dynamic that we've got in society, and Peter touched on it in some ways in his presentation too. And it's what I think is a rather disturbing ideological trend of sort of welfare bashing, or the attack of welfare, and sort of delegitimising welfare payments. And I think in some ways this has been a continuing trend. This government's sort of taken it up with great gusto, unfortunately. But we had things that the previous government introduced too, particularly the attack on single parent payments and moving groups of people on single parent payments onto the New Start allowances, which were much less, and as one of the graphs showed earlier, have not kept pace with pensions, so therefore that gap gets wider and wider, and people on those sorts of benefits and payments are doing much worse off than those that are on pensions because of the indexation arrangement for pensions. That happened under the previous government, as did the introduction of compulsory income management in a number of communities, which is now going to get additional oxygen with the forest review. But one of the things that I've picked up, just an anecdotal little thing, was I was talking to some people yesterday at a forum I was at about what they now see on your tax statements. For those of you who have actually received your tax statements in recent times, it now tells you, so-called in the name of transparency, where your tax dollars go, and it sort of breaks it down by different welfare recipients, or different classes of welfare, as well as other expenditure items. Where the public monies go. And I think this is actually part of this disturbing trend as well. And somebody said to me, we're now actually going to be able to sponsor people on welfare, you know, and there goes my tax towards that person who's on welfare. And it's creating this enormous divide and, you know, this sort of debate about the deserving and undeserving and the notion of whose money it is. So I actually think we've got some major concerns, you know, beyond just the quantum of the funds that are being made available, about the sort of thought processes that are going behind it. And the third point I want to briefly make, and I want to also pay tribute to not just the two-pager, but the full report that John and his team have actually put out, and that the Premier's tucked under his arm and taken to Canberra today to argue the case for South Australia, is a lot of our focus has been in the presentation today about the impact on individuals or households, and rightly so, because that's where it is hitting hardest. But what we've also found, and I think the state government's lamented that we haven't quite got the sort of traction out there in the public domain, although it has spent a bit of money on advertising on this front, is what are the impacts on services as a result of the reductions in the funds transfer from the Commonwealth to the states in critical areas like education and in health, and as Alice has touched on, in housing. And they don't only have an impact in terms of being a drag on services, because clearly over time they will actually have a negative result on the range of services that the public can access, you know, whether that means bigger class sizes or whether that means longer waiting lists. It comes in many different forms, or even, you know, fewer public housing and community housing options for people. But it has a compounding impact because I think, as John's report so well demonstrates, it'll actually have a further reduction in employment in this state. I think it was about 7,000 was the figure that was actually quoted in a couple of years' time, when those reductions actually have their biggest impact. That, in a state that's really struggling with employment, is going to actually have, you know, a very significant effect on the state, and a state that really doesn't have a bustling economy at the moment that can actually replace those jobs with alternatives. My fear is, and I guess it's the final point I want to make, is, and I'm not the first one to make this, is that this is probably softening us up with the broader debate about, you know, the responsibilities of the Commonwealth vis-a-vis the states, is to a further debate about increasing probably our most inequitable of taxes, which is the GST. And I think that's something that we need to be very wary of. And I think some people are already starting to concede that we're going to actually have a debate where we're going to have a rise, an almost inevitable rise in either the rate of the GST or its application across you know, a range of products that it's currently excluded from. And I think that's an enormous risk for our poorest households, because it is such a regressive tax. So, they're my points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, and to our panellists for those very thoughtful reflections on Peter's contribution. The good news is that we do have just under 20 minutes for questions, comments. So if you'd like to put your hand up and just take the, yes, just here.
In an attempt to paraphrase what you just all said, you're telling me that someone is wanting to run a society like a small business, ideologically driven. But how do we combat that? What do you suggest we do to turn around this disturbing trend?
I'll grab that. I think in some ways Ross touched on it in terms of the comments he made around the campaign that SACOSS ran in the lead up to the state election, in terms of trying to actually have a much healthier debate about our responsibilities as a community in terms of our contributions. You know, I mean, I think that at one level, you know, we have a society that does want to reward endeavour and hard work, and I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that. But what we don't actually have is a similar debate about our responsibilities to look after, you know, other people in the community, particularly those that actually get left out of an economy, you know, even when it's doing well. And you know, I think that's the debate that we need to actually have more of in Australia. And ultimately, if we have that, we might have some different attitudes that which will push our politicians to think a little differently about a tax system that is fairer. You know, every time we talk about tax systems, I think there's an expectation about, you know, as Ross was saying, how can we make it fairer for me? Well, you know, I think we need to change that attitude to say, how do we actually make it fairer for everyone in a way that will actually benefit the whole economy and actually allow us all to thrive?
In terms of new possible sources of income from taxation. You know, we heard, I think last week, about some big companies only paying minimal tax, and was it Hardy's don't pay any tax. And, you know, building on from the negative gearing that allows richer people to evade tax as well. I'm also puzzled about governments encouraging salary sacrifice as well. I mean, because surely that is taking money out of the taxation system. I don't know who can answer that.
Ross can answer that.
It's interesting. The not-for-profit sector enjoys some particular privileges where this is concerned. So, in fact, one of the things that is available to a particular class of charities is that their staff can sacrifice some of their salaries. Now, the main rationale, as I always understood it, was that in fact it was a way of helping those organisations who often are doing it, you know, having a hard time getting income themselves, giving their staff some terms and conditions that in fact reward them, because it's also recognised that most of those workers work in circumstances where they're not remunerated in the same way that they would be if they were working in similar parallel positions in either the public sector or in private enterprise. And so it was a way of compensating, if you like, and a tax transfer, if you like, as well.
Can I just say very quickly, I mean, that's very true in terms of the history, but it is a very perverse incentive, and it certainly advantages those on higher salaries, and therefore it's not an equitable way of passing that sort of benefit on. I mean, my view is if governments are really concerned about the charitable sector, and I'm part and parcel of that, then they should fund them properly rather than actually rely on those sorts of benefits which are skewed towards the wealthy.
It's also in state government, people can salary sacrifice.
Yeah, in certain health and other areas, they can too. Yep.
And it's where it is where some of the superannuation benefits actually accumulate to those who have the most income in that context.
I'm wondering if Peter or anyone in the panel has any analysis or comment on the interaction of falling real wages, as recently reported, and the sort of budget picture that you've described.
Well, I mean, one of the things that is very striking, if you compare the current proposals with previous budget consolidations, which were the very big reductions in the budget deficit in 1988, 89 and in 1996, that was at a time when economic recovery was well underway, unemployment was falling. Now, so what we've got now is a very different situation. It's not in a situation where unemployment's been falling for 2 or 3 years. It's where, unemployment, sort of just a lot of debate about unemployment at the moment, but it appears to be going up. So I personally believe that we do need to achieve a balanced budget by matching how much we collect in revenue with how much we spend, at least by the middle of the next decade. I think doing it too rapidly now is a problem. One of the things that's really striking is, as I said, if you look back at what's happened to household incomes in the period up to 2008, we had what was historically unprecedented and very unusual. And so people are now talking about how do we get back to that income growth. And I think we need to recognise that while it would be a good thing to have sort of substantial income growth, that we're very unlikely to get back to that situation. It was we're not going to have another mining boom, of that order in the near future. So we are in a very difficult situation going forward. I mean, the real wage question, clearly if you look at what's happened in the UK and in the US, that they do have that problem. We don't seem quite to have that problem yet, but it is a possibility. So I think that we need to be very careful about how we structure the budget changes in the context in which we're actually facing that is not like what we've faced in the past.
Thank you everyone for a very thought-provoking session. I'm interested in, Peter, you have said that there are alternative options, and one I'll just throw into the pot that I never seem to hear talked about is, I think up until about the 1960s, there used to be healthy death duties or estate duties, and it seems to me, I'm really concerned about the outcome of inequality in our society that is really scary and does nothing for the welfare of Australia overall. So I just wonder, why can't we introduce inheritance tax, death duties, estate, whatever you want to call it, on the very rich, because that compounds the inequality where millionaires hand their millions on to the families and then it's inherited in a few generations. That just massively skews the whole equality of Australia. So I just wonder, that's one option I'd like to see considered, but there are probably lots of other great ideas as well. We really need to be pooling these ideas and have some ideas to put forward to the government to say, yes, we want to address inequality and this is how we can do it. Thanks.
On that, the Grattan Institute last year released a report on the future budget challenges. And as I said, I think these are, it's mainly, and in fact, fortuitously, that chart came up, somebody pressed it. This is the net benefits received by age. So this is after everybody pays indirect taxes, direct taxes, takes account of health and education. And what you can see is the net benefits are much, much bigger for people over 65. And yeah, that's true everywhere, right? But the issue challenge we face is that that's going to be the biggest growing group in the population in the next 10 years. So the Grattan Institute estimated that, if we don't have any change in policy, the budget deficits across all levels of government in Australia is going to be about 4% of GDP in the mid-2020s. That's about $60 billion a year. Now, so that's a lot of money to make up. My view is that you don't make it all up in cutting spending. You have to raise taxes. Part of the problem we have is that both political parties don't like talking about raising taxes. One of the things that is not well understood in Australia is that after 2000, inequality in market incomes in Australia fell. So this is what you get from earnings from investment and capital. It fell, and the reason why it fell is that lower income families got a lot of employment. But income after taxes and benefits rose, and that's because the tax system and the welfare system became less effective at reducing inequality than they did in the past. So the problem we have with inequality, as is the problem we have with the deficit, is that our systems have become less effective at reducing inequality than they were. I'm comfortable with the going back to the to the capital gains tax that we used to have. With negative gearing, I think, why don't you just gear rather than negatively, so that you can deduct up to, how much income you're actually losing rather than above and beyond that, or the income you're actually earning from the property, and so on. But also I think that we need to look at the system as a whole. So I'll be heretical here. The countries that have the most effective tax and welfare systems in reducing inequality are the Scandinavian countries. They have very heavy indirect taxes, but they then spend the money on adequate benefits and good services. And I think you have to look at the taxes and benefits together. And you have to get to the situation where people recognise that for the services they want, they have to pay the taxes to get it. That's easier said than done, but I think that's what we need to have a debate about in Australia going forward.
I was quoted this week as calling for inheritance taxes return as well. And that was on the back of some data about what was going on with income, the differences in the quintiles as to how incomes were growing. The chart, I don't know whether we can get it up, the chart that I was really interested in terms of trying to prosecute this discussion, I think goes to the chart that Peter showed about how people benefit over time from the social security system. There is, I think, fundamentally a position that we all assume that it's somebody else that in fact needs and gets from the social security system. But the fantastic thing about that chart is that it tells a story that reminds us all that we're all a part of it, or most of us are a part of it. There'll be the mega rich that probably never worry about it. But in fact, for anybody in those sort of probably sort of bottom 3 quintiles, will inevitably end up somewhere here, and potentially even someone in the 4th. So we need, in a sense, in order to convince the rest of the population that we might need to change and make arrangements for the future, we need to prosecute the argument that we've all got a part, we'll all benefit if we can make it happen. The other issue with inheritance taxes, of course, it's one of those kinds of payments that requires all of the states to agree. And it was Joe Biolchi who, some time ago now, made the decision to be the first one out. And of course it was one of the things that led to a whole lot of people moving to Queensland. The other thing to be aware of is that the rich have always been very good at securing their inheritances in ways that protected them from many of those taxation processes. So sometimes the people who ended up paying were the people who had the least ability.
I was just going to make one other comment. As I said, really to understand what's going on, you need to look at what happens over time. And this is one illustration, but in other parts of the report that the University of Melbourne put out, only 3% of the population are in exactly the same income position over a 10-year period. People move up and down all over the place. So nearly half the people who started off in the bottom 20% were somewhere else 10 years later. Nearly half, exactly the same, 47% of the people who were in the top 20% were no longer there 10 years later. So, people, these, and this is only for 10 years. If you looked at this over 40 years, unfortunately, difficult things happen to people all the time. And, it's across income. It's only the super rich who actually escape this.
One final question here. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so just here.
Okay, my name is Dan Etherington. I'm from Canberra, and if you go back to the previous chart, I'm over the 75 mark, and apparently I'm receiving massive benefits. I am receiving massive benefits, but not necessarily from the state, in the sense that I was very fortunate to have been employed from the time I left high school. I was either employed or in full-time university, etc. And so I have superannuation. And I keep getting surprised a couple of times a year when I suddenly get another check from the government, which I didn't ask for. I don't need, so these benefits, is that simply, Peter, the pension, people going on pension, or does it include superannuation payments for people who've been employed over their life or whatever?
The two biggest components of that are age pensions and healthcare. So older people benefit from healthcare because they're more, it's valued at what you'd have to pay for an insurance policy if public healthcare didn't exist. And older people, because they're much more likely to end up in the healthcare system, get a much bigger value. There's also public housing and other things as well, but it's basically the age pension and healthcare. If it's superannuation, even if it's public sector superannuation, it's counted as your private income, not as government spending. So it doesn't include that superannuation from the public employment.
We're probably going to have to wind it up there. It's 12:30, and always best to end on time. But can you please join me in thanking Peter Whiteford in particular. We have a small gift of Hayes chocolates for Peter to take on the way back. Thank you, Peter. And also thank our panel. And can I just say in closing that I'd encourage you to go to the WISER site, www.adelaide.edu.au/WISER, and you'll be able to get a copy of the report that's been referred to today. But also, as we speak, NatStem and WISER have released national data which picks up on the distributional impacts of the federal budget by electorate, interestingly, and also by local area as well. This data has been released. You can go onto the NatStem website and onto our website and search your area and find out what the impact of the budget is on your area. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that and circulate that link in the interests of understanding what the distributional impacts are of the federal budget. It's been great to see so many people here today. On behalf of the Dunstan Foundation and WISER, thanks for your attendance, and we really look forward to seeing you again in the near future. Thank you.